Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. There's an ongoing debate in political circles about a partisan realignment that appears to be underway. Working class voters and voters of color seem to be turning a little more to the Republican Party with each election cycle. And this is not what people who believed that demography was destiny predicted. Some see this as a fundamental political realignment on right-left grounds. The argument is, and has been for most of my life, that this is actually a center-right country, and so we are just seeing those center-right values show up at the polls amongst people of color and the working class. Some see it as a realignment based on class itself, that educational attainment is the clearest demarcation line as we watch voters shift away from the Democrats and towards Republicans in some elections. There are ways, though, in which this realignment seems pretty overstated. The shifts are quite subtle election by election to begin with. They are there, they are observable. I am not denying that they exist, but they are subtle. And in a closely contested electorate, a few points here or there among key demographic groups in particular states can mean the difference between winning and losing. It's also unclear to me that this is really about right-left and not about charismatic candidates who appear to be challenging a status quo that most people in those groups are not particularly satisfied with. But there are also some who believe that educational attainment is a proxy for racial resentment attitudes. Some say it's personality types. Some say it's just sort of broadly cultural, that people who go to college tend to live in urban areas, tend to surround themselves with other people who went to college, tend to come from families that went to college, that this is just straight up cultural differences that exist based on whether or not you've been exposed to a college education. There does not seem to be a consensus about what I might call the mechanism of action here, the way in which college education seems to divide voters along left-right grounds. It's also important to acknowledge that it has a different magnitude of effect among white voters than it does among voters of color. The difference between college-educated voters of color and non-college educated voters of color is much more subtle amongst those voters than it is amongst white voters along the same divide. What interests me about these analyses is that embedded in them is this sense among those who work in politics that they're just not really in touch with the experiences of the median voter, and that maybe one of the reasons for that disconnection for them as elites in the parties is that most people who work at elite levels of partisan politics are themselves highly educated. And in contrast to the at least 6 in 10 Americans who do not have a college degree, they're operating in a world that is very different from the people they are trying to persuade. That sense of a class and education gap is not imaginary. I think it can be very hard, however, to disentangle specific political positions from what I might just call kind of corporate culture problems. These organizations, both on the left and the right, have their own beliefs and symbols and practices and shibboleths. And these sort of folk ways, if you like, can alienate the people who work within those parties and institutions from their opposition and also from the very constituents they are trying to court. Prior to the election, a book came out examining this realignment and how it was specifically remaking the GOP. It is called Party of the People: Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition Remaking the GOP. I found it to be certainly conservative-leaning, but also fair-minded. It's a pretty sensitive exploration of the working class versus elites divide. And in it is also a kind of undercurrent of optimism about Americans and the American experiment, which can be really hard to come by these days and might not resonate with everyone. It speaks to me. I recognize that I also come from a particular place and a particular kind of background where it might. I don't agree about everything in the book. However, for one thing, it's not clear to me that the populist coalition the author describes is remaking only the GOP. It's not clear to me that the answer is to continue a longstanding Democratic tradition of triangulation on policy and punching left. But I was able to sit down and talk to the book's author. He is Patrick Ruffini. He is author of Party of the People and a founding partner at Echelon Insights. He is an expert in political realignment and demographic trends, and he joined me to talk about his book. Here is our conversation. So, Patrick, thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I've been wanting to talk to you about this book for a while, so I'm glad we finally found time to talk to each other. Maybe just as a starting point, you can kind of orient the conversation in what your background is and what you do at Echelon and kind of how you came to write this book. A little bit of background
Yeah.
there.
For the last 10 years, I have been a partner at Echelon Insights, a firm I co-founded with Kristen Soltis Anderson in 2014. My arrival on the scene, let's say, as in the polling and research world was pretty unusual because you don't typically find a lot of career switching when it comes to political consulting or public affairs consulting. So I started in digital media, and digital media with a heavy emphasis on data-driven learning to figure out what works and to optimize for the clients that we were working with. So it was really coming together of traditional research methods, plus we do a lot of digital work, a lot of analytics work. So really encompassing all of those different disciplines, and 10 years old and still going strong.
That's great. And so, this book comes out before the 24 election, but certainly after both the 2016 and 2020 elections started to show some changes in kind of a mainstream coalition of voters. And why don't we just start with what made you want to write this book? What was it that you were seeing in the data or that you were just observing that made you think this was a ripe topic to explore?
Right. I think I first had the idea for something like this. This was late in Donald Trump's first term. And I wanted to make the point that I think I come from, let's say, the traditional wing of the Republican Party, that more establishment wing that has really gone almost extinct practically in this era. And that was really my start in politics. But early on, during the George W. Bush years, there was always talk about, can Republicans be more of a party of the working class? Can they be more of a party that reaches out to diverse audiences and wins more Latino voters, wins more Black voters? And part of the worry in 2016 with Donald Trump was that he was somebody who did not seem suited to do any of those things, could potentially turn off rising groups in the electorate. And there was a very much of a sense in the Republican Party at the time, and I'm talking late Obama era here, that people had really bought the Kool-Aid of an emerging Democratic majority. So you had the famous Republican autopsy after the 2012 election, talking about Republicans needing to moderate an immigration as a result, not of Donald Trump, but as a result of the 2012 election. So this really goes way back. But what we're starting to see, heading into the 20 cycle, is obviously Trump was able to capture a large chunk of working class voters in 2016 and get elected on that basis, realign some states, right, that Republicans had consistently lost, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. But there were signs heading into 2020 that he's doing better with Hispanic voters. He's doing better with Black voters. And so sort of heading into that election, right, a lot of the polls project that Trump is on track to lose big, and he doesn't lose big. He loses by a very, very narrow margin. And so a big part of the reason was that he had started to realign working class voters of color on the same basis as he kind of realigned those white working class voters, that there seemed to be kind of this united front, this populist coalition that spanned across racial lines. And, I thought that was important enough to write a book about. Now, I was really always trying to caveat this, because it's like, usually when things go one way, one election, they usually maybe go the other way in the next election. But it turns out that that didn't happen, right? This proved strong enough, durable enough, to the point where Trump won the 2024 election, and he won specifically because he did better with these groups.
So I think this was maybe the thing that, coming into the book, as I initially picked it up, maybe it's because I know that your background is in conservative politics, but I was thinking what I was going to get was a description of a emerging Republican majority, but you take quite a bit of care to talk about it's actually this populist majority, and that it isn't really all that left-right. Like, I don't know, there's left and right to it, but it is not a clear left versus right situation. It is this kind of mainstream center of the American electorate, and that some of the inflections around why people tilt in a particular direction or not have a lot to do with educational attainment, have a lot to do with working class versus non-working class kind of constituencies. And so I think the thing that I took from it was like, oh, okay, this is this is a little more ecumenical maybe than I was expecting it to be, and that that part of what you are laying out is, in a sense, I mean, I don't want to put your words in your mouth. My sense of it was what you're really interested in is this kind of working class plus voters of color that are starting to align more with each other than they are necessarily aligning with like strict ideology of either party. Is that fair, or what, am I being wishful thinking about that?
There's certainly there's elements of both to this,
Hmm.
right? There is the fact that under the 20th century political alignments, that what you actually did have was something very similar to what you describe, but it was happening inside the Democratic Party.
Right.
So it was you had African American voters, Latino voters, working class white voters, uniting under this umbrella, held together both by, let's say, racial group voting patterns and perceived racial group interest,
Hmm.
plus the sense that Democrats were this party of the working person, right? And it wasn't something that was super ideological, right? It was something that was very much, it was very much, it wasn't super ideological. It was very much, you had liberals in the party, but that was just one wing of the party, right? You
Right.
had moderates, you had conservatives, you had Southern Democrats, you had, all of these different constituencies all under one umbrella. That starts to break down in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, and there's signs of it in the 1960s. And
Hmm.
you get to 2016 and kind of another kind of dam breaks in 2016, and then
Hmm.
another dam breaks in 2024. But and the argument I think here is to some extent that you actually do have a much more of an ideological alignment in the electorate. So if you identify as conservative, if you have, let's say, conservative values and instincts that are not necessarily tied to a political party or specific political program,
Hmm.
but that are more about maybe your cultural values, how you view family, those sorts of things, you're voting more and more on the right. I mean, you're voting more
Hmm.
and more for Republicans in alignment with that, regardless of kind of that 20th century coalition, right?
Mm.
And so I think partially that. Now, does that mean that this is a very right wing electorate? Probably not. In fact, I think it's just a much more moderate electorate than I think the existing Republican base is. They're just more aligned, right, with Republicans at the moment than they are with Democrats.
So I want to back up slightly for a couple of other things. And one is maybe the way you're defining, because I think this is often one of the tricks of of analysis is defining groups. And so I'm curious about the working definition that you used in the book for who we're talking about when we talk about the working class, because I think oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, increasingly lately, like, and you quote David Shore in the book, but David Shore has a real kind of diploma divide hypothesis that is clearly a core
Yeah.
component of your analysis as well, but it's a little bit broader than that. Maybe you could just talk a bit about how you think about that definition of the term.
I think, look, I mean, the clear divide that exists is that diploma divide.
Hmm.
Working class is, I think, more of, it seems to me, more of, how we talk about it is more and more a definition of this kind of political trend that we've seen between, again, these very non-college educated places swinging right, these very college educated places swinging to the left. And that's the shorthand that gets applied to it. But I think
Hmm.
fundamentally, it is a diploma divide. But I would argue that's actually pretty important, that education divide. is very important because it is a cultural divide, really. Fundamentally, it's not just, oh, do you have the diploma? Because in many ways, it means you grew up in a certain community, most likely. You grew up with a certain set of expectations. You're much more likely to leave the place where you were growing up, to maybe move to a big city, to find economic opportunity. There are all sorts of behaviors and values that come with having a diploma or not having a diploma that are upstream of politics, but really have fundamentally reshaped the politics of the country. So is it, maybe the most technically correct term to say working class, right? No, because perhaps you do have people who are, let's say, who have done quite well economically. Maybe you're a plumber, maybe you own a small business. You never got a college diploma. By the way, those people are swinging right too.
Yep.
And that turns out that's why it's the political distinction that what you're seeing is kind of strictly economic distinctions between rich and poor Americans become less and less important. Actually, they become supplanted by this education divide.
And I think that is of particular. So I do a lot of work in higher education, but it is chiefly for people who never got the undergrad. They didn't go straight to college. That's the audience. They didn't go straight to college, or if they did not complete their diploma. And in your you have this wonderful section where you describe the median voter, Jen, and she's the person that I spend most of my my time when we're working with this particular client talking to. Right? She's got some college, she's got an office job, she lives in a suburb in, broadly speaking, sort of the industrial Northeast. She's in her 50s. She's got a good job. It's a solid job. It's not super high paying, but between her and her husband's income, they can afford their mortgage. All of those things are extremely, I spend most of my life talking to exactly this person. And so I know her extremely well. And I think that there is a really interesting component of this conversation about college attainment. And one is just, as you say, if you went to college, we've discovered this over all of our projects. Of course, it's well known and documented that the greatest predictor of going to a college degree attainment is having come from a family where people went to college. If your parents went to college, you're pretty likely to go to college. If your parents didn't go to college, it's more of a toss-up. Maybe you have a false start. You have to come back and do it later because you can only be a nurse's assistant for so long before you want to make more money or something like that. You also have an interesting set of distinctions of people who do have a college degree because it is required for their profession, but that profession is, I think we would kind of code as more or less working class. It's service industry stuff. It's healthcare. It's lower level. I don't know if that's the right way of thinking about it, but it's non-surgeons, in the healthcare profession. And I think this is a really useful, I just encourage people to read that section of the book because I think it expands the view of what working class means. I mean, I remember a lot of the kind of Democratic side punditry after 2016 objecting over the income levels of Trump voters, clearly not understanding that general contractors can make quite a bit of money, right? And there are still people who wear boots to work, and didn't get a college degree. What are some of the other, you laid out some of the things that are sort of experiential about getting a college degree, but what else are you thinking of when you think about the kind of difference of experience or difference of perspective that a college education offers people that separates them from the working class?
Yeah, there is this whole the big five personality traits, and one of them is sort of this idea of openness to experience. That's where my mind goes because it's sort of this this personality trait that's actually very closely associated with politics. But I just think about the world I came from, right? Looks very different than the world most Americans came from. And there's some stuff. There are just some things, right? That when you actually, maybe it's not as quite as true today, but when you look back at generation, in 1990, maybe 1 in 10 Americans had a passport. College graduates are 5 times more likely to have traveled to multiple countries outside the country. They read far more books. Obviously, you see books in the background, right? So it's just quite a different world than I think. Obviously, I'm cognizant that, I may have blinders on too.
Hmm.
It's very important for anyone who graduated college, I think, and I think that's a valid distinction. People don't think that necessarily like, oh, you've got it made if you graduated college, but really, it is pretty significant. It is a pretty significant step. That's something that you are in, a version of the elite if you graduated college, and in terms of being in the top 35 to 40% of the country. Particularly if you graduated from an institution that's maybe not just an Ivy League institution, but let's just say you graduated from Florida State or UNC or a flagship state university campus, right? That is actually like, you are, kind of educationally, you're in that kind of upper stratum of society, but that's almost all the people in politics, right? The people who are in professional politics who make decisions both in policy and on campaigns and the kinds of campaigns that they run. And I think on both sides, you have a tendency to really a very strong default
Hmm.
to try to do things, to try to create strategies that really appeal to people who are like yourself.
Right.
Because frankly, I mean, we don't have instant polling on every single issue, right? I mean, you kind of have to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And so
Hmm.
you're really carried along the stream of,
Right.
maybe what's going on Twitter or social media or what's happening in your own social circles. That's just a very powerful default. And I think I've seen it in both parties. It's not just the Democrats
Hmm.
that default to this kind of college educated base. It also can be the Republicans. And that's where I kind of start out that, with that whole chapter is really laying out
Hmm.
the ways in which those experiences are not reflective of the majority of the country.
Right. And I guess the thing that is, of course, de- debated frequently is essentially, which way does the kind of mechanism of action work? Is it people who go to college already have a set of predispositions politically, have personality traits, have kind of cultural backgrounds that lend themselves more towards certainly liberal cultural perspectives? Or is it something that happens when you go to college? I don't know if you have a sense of like what's because you also have like John Sides and others writing about like actually educational attainment is just a proxy for attitudes about race, and so they're highly correlated with one another, and so it's just as likely that it's attitudes about race that explain things as about educational attainment. And I think the question when I talk to pollsters about this and social political
Right.
scientists is like, yeah, there's a divide. We're not really sure what's causing it. Like, in particular, maybe
Right.
among white college educated people, why does that tend to draw them so far away from white non college educated people?
Well, look, I think it's absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely for me more likely to be a proxy for something, right? And again, it's kind of what family you grew up in, and how you see your path forward, right? And if you see your
Mhm.
path forward is partially moving up in a sort of professional class, white collar occupation, right? I mean, so there is this very definite pathway that to some extent you're choosing before you go to college, right? It's not like
Mm,
you're going to go to college and become a welder,
right.
right? Right. So there's
Not
something you have
usually,
very
anyway.
clearly have in mind,
Yeah.
right? That would be very interesting if that were the case, right? But you have a path that you very clearly have in mind for yourself, and if you didn't go to college, right, you also have a path. I think culturally, those two things are very, very different from one another. So I do buy this idea, right, that it is, it is something that is innate, kind of happens before, perhaps,
Mm.
that you go and it sort of becomes maybe mutually reinforcing, right? You go and you also pick up more and more
Mhm.
of those values as you do.
Right. And I think that that makes some intuitive sense because obviously, I mean, I think we were introduced through our mutual friend, Bill Butler, because he and I worked on a magazine together in college, which was the conservative coded magazine for the University of Oregon. And I'm not conservative and never was, but the sensibility of the magazine I enjoyed. And it was also Oregon libertarian, which is, I think, quite a bit different than other people's libertarian. But in any event, like we all went to the same college, we took many of the same classes. I'm probably even more liberal than my mother is. That's probably because my dad was like an SDS guy in college. So I got more of my politics maybe from my dad. But like, we all went to the same college. We did not come out with the same politics. And so there is something about the filters and perspective of that college educated worldview, but it does not guarantee liberal, capital L, liberal political views. I mean, and I think that is the thing that particularly amongst like the Democratic pollsters that I talk to, they find frustrating about the conversation. And I'm probably with you on thinking part of it is it's very hard to look outside your own experience, and to have this conversation feels maybe a little bit like an attack for them.
Well, look, I mean, I think that there are tendencies on both sides. I mean, particularly the white college educated voter is actually a pretty 50-50 voter. I mean, I think it currently leans a little bit Democratic, but it is not a one-sided by any means. But do I see it getting much, much more Republican? Probably not. Right. But, it is going to be pretty divided moving forward. I do think that very much because there is this real risk of capture, right, of the party organization, of the party, essentially when you reflect the taste and preferences of what is fundamentally a minority of the population, then you're going to do things that are strategically maybe not great or not as good as you could have been doing. I think part of that is you saw this in 2024, right? That to the extent that the Democrats really post the Harris switch seem to be headed in a good direction in terms of addressing these quality of life, cost of living issues. Trying to get in a better spot on immigration, right? These things that were really dominant issues in the electorate overall, but especially with working class voters, and then closing out the campaign on this more high-minded democracy message, right? Which I think is I think it's ultimately a function of preference, like the preference of Kamala Harris, her team, and the ethos, right, of that type of voter.
Right.
It's coincided with her decline in the polls. Now, maybe there's not like a perfect one-to-one causation there, but I think it's a very powerful example of this kind of capture that you see of the college-educated voter in the Democratic Party.
So I think this is particularly interesting in the context of something else you point out in the book. And I had seen similar charts in some of Larry Bartels did a paper, I think in 2017 after the 2016 election, mapping out issue-based preferences against party preference. And you do see a lot more culturally moderate Democrats than you see culturally moderate Republicans. And so there's like a lot of easy shifts that can be made when two candidates seem otherwise pretty similar, but this one shares my cultural values a little bit more. I can easily tilt towards that candidate. But really the thing that was interesting about it is that most people are not strongly ideological. They don't have strong left or right alignments, with the exception of these particularly white college educated people, but or at least a large subset of them. But the kind of, I always picture fireflies in a field when I think about people's actual political perspectives, where they're sort of blinking in and out all over the place because their views don't hang together in a clear, hard left versus right set of perspectives. And so that does start to tilt itself towards this conversation about populism. And again, I think this is one of these terms that's real loosey-goosey depending on who's talking about it. And I'm curious about how you define populism as you understand it from looking at all the data that you looked at for this book.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few definitions of it, right? And I think right now, it's just in terms of what's going on right now, I do think that there is a misuse of the phrase potentially, and because it can be defined a variety of different ways. So
Mhm.
there was this famous chart generated after the 2016 election that showed these ideological quadrants of the American electorate, which is like you've got your if you've taken one of those political compass quizzes, it's are you economically conservative or liberal? Are you socially conservative or liberal? And it showed a large number of voters, particularly the voters who flipped to Trump, were in this so-called populist quadrant, which was defined at the time as being economically liberal
Mhm.
and socially conservative, right? So there's that particular mix and blend of beliefs, right? And I think right now, right, I mean, there's sort of the sense of Donald Trump doing tariffs the way he's doing them, really co-opting what was once the ethos of, let's say, the labor movement, right, which was
Mhm.
very, the Democratic Party was always pushing for fair trade, right? Was really he's delivering this dream, right, that both parties had suppressed for a long time, but was really existed more within the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. You also have, what I feel like are, you also have what I feel like are, is a third dimension to this,
Mm.
which I think exists independent, and I think it is actually more salient. It's sort of a mistrust of institutions, right, in general.
Mhm.
And it encompasses a through line, everything from, okay, isolationism. Yes, there is isolationism versus internationalism. This sort of Maha vaccine skeptical thread to it. Uh,
Mhm.
this sense of, the politicians are just basically greedy assholes and corrupt, all of them, the whole lot of them, and we need to radical change to throw and upend the system, which is what for these voters, that's what Donald Trump represented. That's more of a temperamental populism, right? Sort of
Yeah.
distrust of elites. And I think that's actually the more active form of
Mhm.
this to an extent, right? That it's not just people having these sort of these very carefully calibrated views that are, okay, I'm more culturally on the right, but economically on the left. I don't think people actually think about issues in that way.
Yeah. You made me think of another thing, which is obviously, Blue Rose research has been going around with a truncated version of what is obviously a much longer deck for somebody else's benefit, um, and making this diploma divide argument for sure, but also making an argument that had turnout been better, it would have performed even better for Trump. Obviously, you also have a different analysis coming from Adam Bonica and some other folks looking at other data sets. They'll be refreshing that when the CCES data comes out. Um, that sort of says, I don't know, it is undeniable that twice as many Democrats didn't, people who have voted Democrat over the last, three biennial elections, twice as many didn't vote as Republicans who didn't vote, registered Republicans who have a history of pulling those ballots. And so it is interesting to think about if you're in that temperamental populist mindset, you have an outlet for that if you identify as a Republican. It is Trump's burn it down politics. It is his like total disruption politics, right? If, on the other hand, you're a Democrat looking to express your temperamental populism, the Harris campaign wasn't it, right? Like that was not a vehicle for your dissatisfaction with the status quo or with institutions or with these politicians that we think are all corrupt, because she was, I think, in a certain kind of ironic sense, became a representative of the status quo, which is, another reason why people might have been like, screw it. Why? I don't really have a choice then. I am I am interested in the Gulf, and in this kind of echo chamber that exists among people who are mostly only surrounded by other people of their educational attainment, socioeconomic status, and so on. And the way that that plays in the party elites, because like I think in the introduction to the book, and I had to like go for a walk after I read this passage because it made me mad. But not what you because it's true, is that in the late 1980s you have the beginning of the Democratic Leadership Council and them saying, Democrats have to figure out a different strategy for winning, which is a little odd. Like they'd held Congress for a really long time. They're really upset about not having the presidency, obviously, and there are other, weakening trends happening there. But literally the admonition from that group is the same as the admonition from that group today, which is you're spending too much time on these interest groups, particularly identity-based interest groups, and not doing enough to represent the working class and the average person. And so obviously it was DLC then, it's Third Way or whatever now. They're giving fundamentally the same advice as before. It's interesting that the Democrats have wound back up in this sort of place of internal criticism and Sturm und Drang about what to do next. And I'm curious, do you think that, what about that criticism do you think is true? What do you think is not quite getting it? What do you think is wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I still think that the fundamental barrier, right, is cultural. This sort of cultural. It's a cultural one that, and I don't want to say it's an insurmountable barrier, but clearly, look, there has not necessarily been a whole lot of resistance, I think, over the last 8 years to the Democrats kind of adopting an affect that is maybe more Reagan-like economic and foreign policy conservatism, because they, are co-opting maybe some of the suburban voters that were lost to Republicans under Trump. And so this idea of making a full-throated critique of tariffs, or this idea of I think Harris is actually going to be good for business, right? It's going to be more stable, and that was also part of the DLC, right? And that was part of the DLC in terms of it was moderation on all fronts. So I think there has been, I think in certain Democratic leaders, right, moderation on these economic questions, right? But I still think there's a much more insurmountable on the cultural issues to signal to a working class voter who knows what they think on those issues. I think the difference between economic and cultural issues is mostly people know what they think on cultural issues. On the economy, they're really voting on the performance of the incumbent party,
right,
and not on any kind of philosophical alignment. I mean, you have far left Bernie type voters, right, who maybe absolutely do vote on philosophical alignment. That's a tiny sliver of the electorate that actually knows or cares what the economic philosophy is of the parties. They really understand what the social issue positions are. In the 1990s, I think Bill Clinton was there, right? In terms of how the Democrats then, and how Clinton in particular, talked about immigration, talked about some of these cultural flashpoint issues, had no problem going and co-opting pieces of a socially conservative agenda and presenting that to voters, because there was a perception, right, that was kind of the more dominant majority in the country at the time. Obviously less so today. In many ways, though, still a majority, right? And that's why he was so successful. So I think that, I think that there is right now, I think Democrats are doing and will do what's easy, what's opportunistic, right? If Trump does something, if Trump screws up, they're going to capitalize on that. But the question is, I think voters are actually paying attention to kind of their positions on cultural issues, and I don't think that there's very much appetite at all to really move on that. I mean, notwithstanding Gavin Newsom going on his podcast and mouthing off. So I think that's really a concern for them forward.
The other interesting bit of sort of series really of data, there have been a bunch of these kinds of experiments where it's asking voters to engage in an exercise that is not the American exercise. It is more of the parliamentary style voting with a multi-party system. And that's also a very interesting set of findings. And maybe you can just sort of summarize broadly what comes up when we do this sort of exercise or experiment with American voters.
Yeah, so every year we do one of these. So we ask that we do our version of that quadrant
Hmm.
exercise, where we show that once again the libertarians, right? Very sorry for your college days, but like your libertarians are the empty quadrant. That those are the socially liberal and economically conservative voters
Yeah,
are
I dated all three of them.
four
They're
to 5% of the electorate, right? Usually.
yeah.
But there's also like kind of a different exercise where we, kind of present five political parties. And the five political parties are you have a nationalist Donald Trump style party, you have kind of a traditional Ronald Reagan style conservative party, you have a, let's say, mainstream, more labor left flavored, kind of what you think of Joe Biden in his heyday kind of
Mhm.
party. You have an AOC style Green Party, and you have what we call the Acela Party, which is my favorite name in the bunch, which is, kind of very technocratic, neoliberal, kind of, pretty moderate on business and economics, but socially liberal. And that mirrors, I think, the debate, right? And you have in these multi-party democracies. And so it's been interesting to see, we've been doing this since 2019. What we've seen on the right is it's almost an even split, but definitely the Trump faction has really kind of taken over. Like
Mhm.
you've seen the steady rise. So even in 2019, 2020, you'd still have more people identify with that sort of old school Republican. Now that's shifted,
Mhm.
partly maybe because of his message on immigration, salience of that issue, whatnot. But in Western Europe, you're also seeing that takeover of those kind
Mhm.
of far right populist parties supplanting these sort of more center right parties. On the left, it's much more interesting in that, in the American context at least, you actually do have a more dominant center left, that sort of, again, that, and it's again that labor left
Mhm.
flavor. But that's, maybe a little bit more moderate, but we took care in the description not to really say anything on social
Mhm.
issues, right? To just make it purely, we will fight for the working class, for healthcare, and that's usually gets 30%. Then the Greens get 10%, and the Acela gets like 10%.
Mhm.
So it really shows you where the center of gravity is. That when you have all these ideological debates within the party, right? You have the debate in the party right now over the Ezra Klein abundance book,
Mhm.
right? And you've got the sniping from the left, and you've got that sort of neoliberal faction that they're duking it out. But that's really a minority of voters, even
Mhm.
on the left.
Mhm.
The bigger piece of the pie is, again, in that a little bit more. They don't really care much about social issues. That's not their thing. But they want a party that will stand for the working class.
Mhm. But it seems like maybe that Acela party is the dominant group of influencers and elites in the party itself. Is that a do you think that's right? I mean, that's from where I
Look,
sit as
it's
a
an
Democrat,
excellent.
that's
I
what it
don't
looks
know
like.
how most people would answer that question,
Mhm.
but it's definitely the conversation, right? The discourse, so focused on these factions that are
Mhm.
probably very tiny in comparison. It's the same way, like, when you actually have a Democratic primary election, like even to the extent that, like, look, we had a Democratic primary in 2020, and there were so many candidates running. Each is appealing to a very, very narrow kind of sliver, and then you've got Joe Biden comes in South Carolina and rolls everything up because all the black voters and the sort of mainstream Democrats kind of coalesce, and
Mhm.
all that stuff doesn't matter. And all the interest group
Yeah.
pandering that you saw in that primary doesn't matter. And that's the pandering that obviously came back to hurt Harris in last fall.
What's interesting to me about that particular set of analysis is, I mean, I'm married to now an American citizen, but from England, so I'm very familiar with their politics. So I can immediately map to the to the UK parties based on the definitions that you have there. It's very legible, and it's a very similar set of problems in UK politics, where it is this sort of technocratic neoliberal left versus the Greens or the woke warriors, whatever that version of the left, and they're punching at each other I think with greater effect coming from the Acela party to the Green Party. It's easier to punch the Greens. And just completely ignoring that Labor left voter who is sitting there going, I can't afford anything. Can you guys help us out here? And I think so that to me was just this really useful sort of way of breaking up what are people's actual kind of preferences, setting aside, it is obviously easier to make cultural issues salient because they speak to values and people understand their values more than they understand like which economic policy is going to directly benefit them, apart from something simple like a tax cut, where like if you know you're in that bracket, you qualify for the tax cut. Cool. I think the question that I have then is, if I were, which I thankfully am not, a Democratic strategist, I would be asking one question here, which is, do we have to punch left on the woke stuff, or can we keep it and just like leave it alone? Don't make it a centerpiece, but don't fight over it, and add the economic populism, add the improvements in social safety net, job creation, et cetera.
Look, I think the overriding thing people are looking for, right, is somebody who's in their corner. Mm-hmm. Economically, obviously there's a cultural component to that too. But, I think that's what the best of the Democratic Party has been, right, historically, you have Bill Clinton, kind of I feel your pain. Mm-hmm. You have even the way, think about the way Barack Obama pitched himself in 2008, which I think was actually pretty different than the retroactive, image, right? I think it was a very blue collar heavy focused campaign, right? And that's how Democrats actually win. And it's about kind of who, being on the side of that working class voter. And I think Trump for now has cornered the market on that. Yeah. Now we'll see how well he performs, right? I mean, if he's seen as doing things that are not directly materially benefiting them, I think that's going to cause problems for him, right? But I think for now, it's not that he has that market on that attribute of cares about people like you, because Democrats still seem to have the market on caring, but fighting for people like you.
Right.
And delivering for people like you. And that's really the positioning that Trump owns relative to this working class voter. But I do think in the absence of that, right, I mean, you kind of have to do something to shake things up, right, if you're a Democrat. And if you kind of are trying to send an unmistakable signal to a working class voter, if you're trying to send an unmistakable signal, I think you have to create some conflict and some tension and really kind of, show how you're different. In the same way, like someone like John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. I mean, I think he is sort of the epitome of this. I mean, maybe stylistically very distinctive. Maybe that goes too far. But I think that's the kind of, for the first kind of politician I've seen on the Democratic side who really has adopted this Clinton-esque sister soldier moment and kind of is constantly kind of punching left. While himself representing, embodying this sort of blue-collar ethos and blue-collar image himself. So yeah, I mean, I do think that, kind of regardless, I think that right now, I mean, the brand is is in such a bad spot that you kind of have to do something to shake your way out of it.
Yeah, I think, my background's the commercial side, and it's sort of taken for granted when you're a large mass market brand that it is cheaper to acquire new customers than it is to retain old customers who don't want to stick around. But there's a limit on that, right? You cannot be bleeding more legacy customers than you are able to onboard through whatever your demand generation campaign is for new customers. You can't really lose all your old customers and expect to grow the brand. And so I think this is one of the strategic challenges, in my view, of the Democratic Party, is this, from where I sit, what it looks like to me is, and I'm not in the party, whatever, but the way it looks is like, and maybe it's also because I live in Suffolk County, New York. So I like the woke stuff is only like It's like minor little, anti-bullying day in the town of East Hampton or whatever. But it's like, it is not as pronounced in our campaign seasons, because it's like John Avlon versus Nick LaLota. It's not, it's not AOC versus Nick LaLota. And I think that the view from here looks like you've got that Acela party punching at the Green Party, ignoring the Labor left. And it's like, okay, if we're going to now punch back at the Acela group, they're, like, how do you get to 51 if you don't have all three of them? It becomes sort of the question strategically. So which customers are you willing to bleed? And who do you think are your best prospects for new customers or returning customers or whatever, becomes a real strategic problem. And again, I wasn't inside the Republican Party either, but it did always strike me as, frankly, and I was expressing this to Rachel Bidikoff the other day, it is a more tolerant coalition of each other on the right. There's a lot less punching to the right from the center than there is on the Democratic side of the party, with some obvious exceptions, right? And they work for the bulwark. But like that is, it just strikes me as like there's an asymmetry there as well, that the Democrats have a bit more, I hate the phrase purity test, but certainly have a lot more kind of litmus tests for being accepted in the inner circle than it seemed like for a long time, at least. I don't know how things are now with the MAGA right, but the old kind of Republican Party was frankly inclusive as long as you were conservative about something. And I don't know if that's what it looks like to you either, but it seems like a real strategic challenge for the Democrats that they need to maybe not always. I mean, maybe it's fine in Fetterman's state,
Well, look, I think that
but not everywhere.
I think there's always. I think we should always be a little cautious of always the grass is greener on the other side of the street, because I could very much make the same argument. Like, Democrats are like a really more functional coalition. I mean, there are moments I've thought like Democrats really are a more functional coalition than Republicans are. I think that to the extent that everything has revolved around the personality of Trump, to the extent that it's actually paradoxically made life easier for moderates. But to the extent, if you're a moderate who I think, says you're willing to support Trump and work with Trump, then in some ways, right, you're welcomed into the tent.
Right.
If you're somebody who, even if you're like if you're Mike Pence, though, who was Trump's VP, right, and ultimately rejected him and told him no, that's not the traditional ideological alignment. I mean, he was like viewed as the, somebody like Pence in the old days would have been viewed as the enforcer from the right, really.
Right.
So you definitely had, I think, all throughout the 2010s, this really fratricidal warfare, I think, between kind of the conservatives and the establishments. And I think Trump has actually resolved. I mean, he actually resolved that in a way such that, it's actually easier, right, to put down these pesky Tea Party primary challenges if somebody goes at the establishment candidate, so long as that establishment candidate is aligned with Trump. Trump is going to endorse them, and that shuts down the issue. So I think that part of it, right, has certainly changed in that. But I think that the axis, right, on which if you absolutely question Trump at all, right, you're cast out of the party. That's a pretty hard line, right?
Yes, you can play ball and keep your mouth shut, but you can't play ball and then say no. and then you're done. I think the thing I'd like to end on is something that I took from you have a I don't know, in the middle of the book somewhere there is a conversation in there about, or a passage about looking at other ethnic groups' sort of evolutions politically in the U.S. political system. And so, like, in particular, the the Irish, in a large wave come after the famine in Ireland. They set up kind of their own sets of institutions and hierarchies, and a lot of that is through the Catholic Church, though not exclusively. And they set up their own kind of political alignments. They vote Democrat for a long time. And then there's this sort of turn when it's like their guy, the first Irish Catholic to run for president, doesn't get picked the second time around. And it's like you start to see this shift that is not complete, obviously, and there are plenty of Irish Democrats, Joe Biden among them, but there are also more kind of alliances formed in other ways. The identity shifts a little bit as they become more affluent, more educated, more mainstreamed. And you make the case throughout the book, which I think is often, frankly, neglected on the Democratic side, especially in the last 10 years, of most groups are in fact materially better off than they were in 1970, right? They are more affluent, they are more educated, they are more mainstreamed. We see this in our screeners. Like we separate out the Hispanic question from an ethnicity or race question because there are plenty of white Hispanics and Hispanics who think of themselves that way. And also just a lot of Hispanics don't think of themselves as non-whites. There are a lot of kind of trying to get into that mass mainstream and just be part of that while holding on to their cultural values. I'm not saying that they're trying to become white. That's a silly construct. But this kind of progression of being more mainstreamed into American life, better off materially in many respects, though, gaps still exist and there's always room for improvement. What I'm getting at is you actually lay out a pretty optimistic story about America in general, right? That actually the story of America is incremental improvement over time, sometimes great leaps of improvement, a general sort of inclusion model over time as ethnic groups become mainstreamed into the center of the country. And that this seems like the thing that is alienating at least some voters of color and working class voters about that kind of left cultural critique of America, that the kind of, and you even cite the stat about white college educated voters are more likely to say that America is not a great place than everybody else. And there's a kind of interesting pessimism, I guess, about that left cultural critique of America that, clearly isn't where I'm guessing, not where you're generally coming from. And it seems like something that is part of the appeal of the right is that, on a long enough timeline, everybody gets to equality, and we're just going to keep plugging away at that. And that's as much.
There is something right to this working class coalition that is, it's sort of not where they are right now. It's not about where they are right now, but where they're going and where they feel like they're going. And it really is a dream of still a dream of trying to move up.
Right.
The latter, particularly for Hispanics, particularly for these new immigrant groups in the country. And there's a lot of evidence that there was a huge shift to Trump among immigrants, specifically in this election. That it wasn't just the Latino voters, but it was specifically the Latino immigrants. It was specifically first generation folks who moved much more so. And I think that is actually a very different perspective than you actually see in a lot of corners of mainstream America and mainstream white America that, really feel down and pessimistic. Not to say nothing of the left, to say nothing of kind of this critical race theory idea of, this country is structurally racist and fatally flawed. And I think one of the great ironies here is as that critique picks up in the Trump era, as that critique of coming from the left picks up, what you're actually seeing in the voting patterns is the exact opposite of these groups flocking to the right or flocking to a candidate identified with the right and against the left, right? And I think that's one of the great ironies of this that everybody thought the 2010s was really about sort of simultaneous movements of identity and rising identity politics across race, gender, sexual orientation. And as it turns out, that, at least the racial identity piece, moves, you have these voters kind of voting less and less along racial lines and voting for Donald Trump of all people.
Yeah, it's an interesting as I was reading that and thinking about how there was, in your narrative, this kind of undercurrent of an essential optimism about America's future and about its general trajectory, which I think I'm actually quite partial to be honest, but surprise. I think it is deeply ironic that the candidate many of these folks are moving to is the one who is constantly talking about how terrible the country is and how, utterly destitute, destroyed, ripped out from the center, like just completely, and is telling the country's on fire.
Yeah, right? But I think there's a hope in that, right? I mean, there's sort of the slogan, Make America Great Again. Like, it's a really bad now, but elect me, it's going to be fantastic. And I think, like, to the extent that, like, he's so boastful, right, and is so confident, projects such confidence in a very kind of black and white manner, right? We are going to be so wealthy after we enact these tariffs. It's sort of hyperbole, right? I mean, that's how people, I think to some extent, they're not as nuanced. That's how people in the working class kind of think a lot of the times, right? Sort of sense of, things are, it's not just doesn't really suck right now. It really, really sucks. But hey, things can, maybe if we do this, we're go in this dramatically different direction. Things can get much better. If you're kind of from a safer perspective, kind of you're approaching things for more from a standpoint of what do you have to lose. So I do think that, like, there is kind of this irony there, but I think at the core of it is, right, Trump as somebody who makes these kind of grandiose promises that no other politician would dream of making, and breaks through as a result of it, perhaps.
This is, I think, one of the most, in a way, kind of depressing components of this, which is I wonder if, in the end, it's far more about candidate charisma than it is about, particular policies. Like we were talking about before, like they know how they feel, but they don't necessarily know like which economic policy is the best one. Is this, right now I feel like a lot of Democratic pundits certainly are talking about the thermostatic effect, and that like it's just a swing back and forth thing, and we're just going to be kind of permanently in a condition of whoever lost last time wins next time and vice versa. But that seems like, there might be a local limit on how effective that thermostatic theory is if the candidate is utterly lacking in.
Yeah, I think, look, it's still a very closely divided country. And, I don't make any predictions, again, emerging Republican majority, or emerging Democratic majority. I think it's kind of foolish to try to project out for more than 2 elections. But look, I think ultimately,
I have both books.
The party in power is going to, if things go poorly under their watch, they're going to be held accountable.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. The book is Party of the People: Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition, Remaking the GOP. What's the best way for people to follow your work?
Yeah, I have a Substack at patrickruffini.com. I'm also post frequently on X at Patrick Ruffini.
All right. Thanks so much, Patrick. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Production by The Difference Engine. Editing by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter at crosstabspod.substack.com or visit our show page at crosstabspodcast.com. We are now on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram as Crosstabs Pod, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We hope you'll follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast service. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. See you next time.